I'm glad we're saving the best for last. Charmaine I will try to make this brief so that we can listen to Charmaine. Like I said earlier, I think I was thinking about this morning, how to frame up what I wanted to say. And I think I want to frame it up into two broad stories. And that is, one story is how I met Charmaine and how I met George. And I think I'm going to start with how I met Charmaine, because I think it's an appropriate way to begin my remarks today. I made a presentation back in 2007, I believe, at the Hawaiian Cultural Center in Midvale, Utah. This was before I had started doing any serious archaeological research at Iosepa, and I wanted to reach out to the descendant community. And so I was able to get an audience there, and in that presentation, there were some concerns raised by some of the descendants about an outsider like me coming in and doing archaeological research on sacred land, the land of their ancestors. And so we had some discussions about that. And one of the resolutions that was proposed was that we gather at Iosepa on a Saturday morning and have what's called an Oli ceremony. And here's a picture of that day. This was a very special day for me. This was really kind of an eye-opening experience for me. I was looking back all those years, I was very naive as an archaeologist. I was just out of graduate school, just barely getting my first job at a university. And so looking back, I am actually very, very grateful for the kindness and the trust that Charmaine and other descendants showed to me at that time. I still do have a ton to learn about the Hawaiian people and the Hawaiian culture, Pacific Islanders in general, but I was light years behind where I am today at this time when this ceremony happened. But you can see that picture on the left. I'm standing next to Charmaine, and Ned Cow there is on the far left, and others, and Tina's in there. But they gave me specific instructions to show up in a white long sleeve shirt and dark pants, and they said show up at this time. And all I knew was that there was going to be some kind of ceremony where chants were going to be made to the ancestors, to the people buried there at Iosepa, and others, one asking permission of the elders, of the ancestors, to allow for this kind of intrusive research, digging into the ground. One thing I've learned from Charmaine and others and George is that the land is sacred. They call it Aina, and it's sacred because life comes from the land and life returns to the land. And so to intrude into that land is a big deal. It's a serious endeavor. And I've learned even recently that the chants, I couldn't understand them. They were in the Hawaiian language, but that they were also partly to kind of ask for forgiveness if I messed up, if I did things that were offensive. Charmaine and Tina and Ned, others wanted to make sure that the ancestors were not upset at them for allowing this to happen. And I didn't know any of this at the time. And so looking back and knowing what I know now, I'm just super grateful for the kindness, like I said, and the trust and the generosity that I was shown at that time. And it's been a wonderful and very enlightening journey for me. And I hope that the descendant community can feel the same way as we've seen what's come out of these relationships. The gourds that you see there on the right, some of those were gifts. I have the one gourd here behind me. This was presented to me at that morning during that ceremony. This was carved by another member of the descendant community, Richard Polson. He's from New Zealand, but his wife, I believe, is from Hawaii and a descendant of the Iosepa pioneers. He's a master carver, and he made this beautiful gourd. I wasn't expecting or knowing any of this would happen, but this is part of the protocol and part of the ceremony. And then those other those other half gourds there were filled with food from the islands, macadamia nuts, fruits, and others. And that is part of the ceremony too. I imagine Charmaine could teach us a lot about this ceremony and many things that I don't even understand or know. But that was how I first met Charmaine. And it was a really amazing experience, one that I still kind of get emotional about when I think about, because it was just a powerful experience, a spiritual experience, I would call it. And I was really, again, grateful for that introduction to Hawaiian culture and the generosity and the trust that I was shown. Going back to my other story now about how I met George, and it was at that same meeting in Midvale at the Hawaiian Cultural Center that I met George and his family. And it was when I put up this slide in my presentation, there's only a handful of deeds that exist here in the Church History Library in Salt Lake City, actual deeds for parcels of land from Iosepa. And so I had transcribed these and put these into this table just to show everyone some of the names of people that had land there. And after the presentation, George, I think, was one of the first people to raise his hands, and during the question and answer period, and he said, you know that slide that you have with all the names of the people, the deeds? He says, my grandfather is on that list. And so I quickly went back to this slide. Says that one right there, first on the list, Mahoe, block 10, lots 1 and 2, 4-room dwelling. That's my grandfather. And I was blown away. I couldn't believe it, right? I never imagined that there would be a grandson of one of these Iosepa pioneers, and that I would be able to meet them. I imagine maybe great-grandsons or great-great-grandsons. I think we have some of them based on the chat. Some of them are here today too. Welcome. But a grandson, that really took me by surprise. But that started our relationship. I got to meet George and his wife Linda and their children, Mike and others. And we've enjoyed many years of friendship since. But it was in that setting that I made a decision also with George and his family's permission that we would start our archaeological research on his grandfather's property. I asked if that would be okay, and they were very excited about that and very supportive. And that's how I chose, of all the different places in Iosepa you could begin to do some archaeological testing. That's how we decided to do our excavations the way we did. So let me go back let me go back a little bit in terms of how we even knew where block 10, lot 1 and 2 was. Most of you, I think, know where Iosepa is, but it's in the Skull Valley of Utah. Here's the I-80 that skirts around the southern edge of the Great Salt Lake. These are the Stansbury Mountains. And as you come, and here's Tooele and Grantsville, right? As you come around the point of the Stansbury Mountains, you'll see a highway sign that says Iosepa, and you get off on this state highway and you head south for about 13 miles. And you'll start to see some agriculture, some farming going on. You see these green crop circles. The Iosepa site is still actively being farmed. There's a ranch today. These are those crop circles. The settlement itself is on the other side of the road here, and the cemetery is here that George talked about. And I'm sure Charmaine will talk about that as well. This is a view of it from the mountains, the Stansberries looking west. And all I knew about Iosepa, I'd been there and I'd kind of walked the landscape and familiarized myself with the ground. But really the only thing I knew about the settlement itself was this plat map that is in the surveyor's office, or at the county, the Tooele County Courthouse. And so I knew that it was organized, in a grid-like pattern, had a central public square, and I knew that the blocks and lots were numbered, and I could see names of the streets and all that. But trying to translate that map to the actual landscape, what seemed impossible, right? You can walk around this landscape and you can see evidences of the former town. There are some foundations that are still there, a couple of different foundations that you can see, and this is one that we've later learned is at the center of the public square, and we'll explain how we learned that. There's a couple other features like root cellars that are still there, crumbling and disintegrating in the environment. Knowing from the archives, right? These are some pictures that Utah State History owns, and I had discovered these in the archives, and so I knew there were houses there. But again, the remains of those houses are pretty much gone and non-extant today. So the challenge was, how do we go from this landscape that has just a trace of evidence on it to how do we figure out where everything was, right? How do you transpose that map back onto the landscape? I was very fortunate to meet the deputy county surveyor at the time of Tooele County, and I showed him this map and said, do you have any ideas about how we might relocate this town site on the landscape today? And he looked at the map with me for a few minutes, and as a trained surveyor, he could interpret it much better than I could. And he immediately zoned in on a couple of marks on the map. It's difficult to see here, but right here, south and center of the public square, in the middle of Honolulu Avenue and the intersection of Honolulu Avenue and Napella Street, there's a little dot, and written in cursive, it says Stone Monument. And he basically said, if we can find that stone monument, we will be able to kind of start to figure out where things were. And sure enough, we went out there using some section lines. You can see that the center of the town square was laid out at the corners of 4 different sections of the township and range. So using that and some basic dimensions, we were able to find the actual stone monument. It still has kind of a crosshairs in it. It's just a small stone that's buried in the ground. And so we had one point on the map that we could use to try to figure out where things were. Going farther south on the same plat map, 2 blocks south, there's another mark that says Stone Monument. And he said, you know, if we can find both of those stone monuments, then we'll have the true north-south baseline, if you will. And using the measurements on the map, we'd be able to lay out the whole town again, theoretically. So we got really excited about that, and we knew kind of the angle in which to look and the distance more or less to look, and we started looking down here, searching for this other stone monument. It took us a while. It was not as easy to find as this one to the north. In our searching, we discovered a few other things that were quite exciting. One was this fire hydrant. George talked about how Iosepa was one of the first towns in Utah to receive pressurized water system. And they had this series of fire hydrants throughout the town, and some of them have been salvaged. One has been taken up to the cemetery as kind of a little monument, and it still sits there today. I've been told that others have been taken by people, and they're in their backyard somewhere in the Salt Lake Valley. But this one, as far as I know, is the final remaining one in its original location, and it's right there at the south edge of the town. Very exciting to find this. It was overgrown with sagebrush, and so it's kind of hidden, but again, we kind of stumbled across it as we were looking for that second stone monument. Another thing we stumbled across, and this one was always really interesting to me, was this historic ice skate. I did a little bit of research on this ice skate and discovered that it does date to the time period of the Iosepa settlement, early 20th century ice skate. I can't tell you for certain that it was used by one of the Pacific Islanders that lived there, but I think there's a pretty good chance. And I've always imagined that there would be a story told about Hawaiians ice skating in the desert of Utah. That just seems like an image that most people would not expect, but here's one artifact, if you will. Again, just on the surface, not even buried on the ground, just lying on the surface and been lying there for over 100 years. A remnant of life at Iosepa. To make a long story short, we eventually did find that second monument. Here's a picture of it. It looks very similar to the other one. It was partially buried, and that's why we couldn't find it. We actually found it as we were taking a small rod and doing just shallow probing until we hit something hard, and we kind of brushed the dirt off around it. It had been pushed over slightly to an angle by cows, I imagine. And so we we uprighted it, made it stand straight up again, took measurements between the two monuments, and it was exactly the same measurement as what the map says it should have been. So this was a very exciting day. And because we knew now that we could now start to locate things on the landscape again. And that's what we proceeded to do using GPS. I think most of you are familiar with global positioning systems. We use satellites, and we can start to pinpoint locations with great accuracy on the surface of the earth. And that's what we did. We teamed up again with the surveyors from Tooele County, and we started to plot out where some of these homes were, these blocks and lots, the homes that we had deeds for. And if you plot those on a map, on the plat map, you can see that everything in yellow or gold there are the properties that their deeds survived for. I know there were more people that lived in Iosepa than just the deeds that survived, but these are the ones that survived. And right here is where George's grandfather and grandmother lived, here on block 10, lots 1 and 2. So this was, that's how I met George. And that's a little background in like how we decided to do the excavations that we did and how we figured out where things were, how we even knew where George's family lived. I will say this, that another powerful experience in my excavations here were to take George and his family, and others actually. We've taken several descendants to the actual spot of land where their ancestors lived, and to have that connection between the past and the present, so tangible and so real, stand on the same exact spot and hear the stories of their ancestors has just been phenomenal. Just honestly, some of the highlights of my career, and been just powerful experiences and formed strong friendships between George and his family and me and others. So I want to talk a little bit quickly about the actual plat map, because I think it's very revealing actually, and reveals patterns, cultural patterns about everything that I know about Iosepa. And that is, it's this very interesting hybrid, if you will, between Latter-day Saint cultural patterns and traditions and Hawaiian cultural patterns and traditions. So at first blush, you see this plat, and it looks very much like any other 19th century Latter-day Saint settlement. It looks almost like Salt Lake City on a smaller scale, with the public square, like Temple Square in the middle of Salt Lake City, with two broad, wider than the other streets, north, south, east, west axes. And like I said, it looks very much like Salt Lake City. And all of these towns were, these Latter-day Saint towns were patterned after this plat of the city of Zion that Joseph Smith, the prophet, created for a place in Missouri in 1833, and that was then replicated and adapted to most 19th century Latter-day Saint settlements and early 20th century settlements. So Iosepa, it falls within that pattern. So on the surface, it looks very much like a Latter-day Saint layout, and it is. But superimposed on that layout, you have Hawaiian culture and Hawaiian tradition. It's in some really remarkable ways. You'll notice that the public square is named Imilani. I learned by talking to descendants and doing research that Imilani means to look for or seek God or the heavens. And that is a very interesting idea when you think about the center of Salt Lake City, Temple Square, and what that means to Latter-day Saints. And that's also, the temple is the place where Latter-day Saints go to seek God or seek the heavens. And here you have these Latter-day Saint Hawaiians, these Latter-day Saint Pacific Islanders, naming their public square after a concept or an idea, a cultural idea that's very similar, but doing it in Hawaiian, which I think is very significant. The two avenues are the ones that run east and south. They're all named after homelands where the Iosepa pioneers would have come from or where their families were from. The most north and south ones were both on Maui, Wailuku and Kula. Going inward, you have two places from the big island of Hawaii. Moving inward, you have two places from Oahu. And then finally, the main axis is Iosepa. And we should say Iosepa is the Hawaiian word for Joseph. Several people have said one way or the other, it's either Joseph Smith Jr., the founding prophet of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or Joseph F. Smith, one of his relatives, his grandnephews, who was a missionary in Hawaii and a beloved apostle and later president of the Church of the Hawaiian Saints. And I think Iosepa was probably first named after him, and then secondarily had meaning for Joseph Smith, also the founder of the church. But so they're assigning meaningful place names to their otherwise Latter-day Saint city plat. Same thing happens on the streets that all run north and south. They're all named after prominent people. The main access being Jonathan Napella Street. And Jonathan Napella was one of the very earliest converts to the church in Hawaii in the 1850s. He helped teach the missionaries the Hawaiian language. He helped translate the Book of Mormon into the Hawaiian language. And he was one of the very first Hawaiians to come to Utah with special permission from the monarchy in Hawaii to receive his temple ordinances, the ceremonies in the temple in Salt Lake City. And he was ordained an elder of the church by Brigham Young himself. And so this is a very important person to the Iosepa Saints, and they named their main street after him. Moving from the west to the east, you've got two prominent chiefess names there, and one was the name of one of the Iosepa settlers. Similar here, you've got Solomona, and just yesterday, Charmaine tipped me off that Solomona was probably named after one of the Iosepa pioneers, Solomona Pi'ipilani. I hope I got that right. And I've seen his name in the census records too. And then there's one named Nephi, which Nephi is the name from the Book of Mormon. It could have also been one of the settlers of Iosepa. You've got other last names here on the eastern streets, and again, two last names of Iosepa residents, prominent Iosepa residents for the easternmost streets. So again, on this otherwise Latter-day Saint foundation, if you will, you have these Hawaiian meanings and place names being superimposed, and it imbues the landscape with a cultural significance that would otherwise be missed unless you pay attention to what these places and what these people mean, and what it means that it's all in Hawaiian language. Hawaiian language was the language that was predominantly spoken at Iosepa. There are minutes of some of their church meetings and whatnot here in the church archives. They're all in the Hawaiian language. And I can't read Hawaiian. So there's a treasure trove of information there for some future historian or historical archaeologist to uncover if someone can read the Hawaiian language. I need to wrap up, but I want to speak a little bit more about some of the things that we found as we did excavations on George's ancestors' property. They're the Mahoe family lot. And let me just tell a couple more stories about this. Here is some of the work that we did on Lot 1 in 2008. And we quickly discovered that just a few centimeters below the surface, there is this layer of cobblestones everywhere in Iosepa, actually. And for a long time, we pondered on whether these were natural or cultural, meaning did George's family put these there as kind of a cobblestone surface, or was this just natural outwash from the mountains? We discovered and determined that these are natural because they are everywhere. And what was interesting about this is that in just one corner of one of our excavation units, these cobblestones didn't exist. And this happened to be in an area where we did some ground penetrating radar here too, that the ground penetrating radar had shown a strong signal. So this was of interest to us. And as we continued to excavate in this particular corner of this one excavation unit, we started to discover a lot of artifacts, hundreds of objects, bottles, ceramic dishes, food remains, personal clothing items. And this thing went down quite a ways. I don't think I'm going to say in public how deep because OSHA might get after me. But lots of different artifacts came out of this. And what we determined after we analyzed these artifacts, studied them, is that this was the privy for the Mahoe family. And what it appears happened is that almost all of these artifacts date to kind of the second half of the 1910s, right about the same time that George's family would have left Iosepa and gone back to the Hawaiian Islands to help build the temple like George talked about. And so what we think happened is that the Mahoe family gathered up what they could to take with them back to the islands, and anything that they couldn't take, they threw down the privy. And because of that, there was just an abundance of artifacts that were in a complete or semi-complete form. Here are some of the ceramics that came out of that. So they were broken, but easily pieced back together into these complete items. And because of that, we were able to do some really interesting studies and learn things about how George's family might have been acquiring these things and using them. I'll just say briefly one thing. One pattern that emerged fairly quickly is that all of the tableware, these plates, if you will, were always plain white. Every single one of them, without a single exception. And all of what we call in archaeology teawares, or these teacups and saucers, always were of some kind of floral pattern. Not always the same. You can see these two are different, but similar enough that they were all of the same kind of style. And at first, using a very American or European perspective, I first interpreted this as that George's family was bringing out, or that they were buying fancier and more expensive teawares because they wanted to show off their status or their wealth to their guests. And I kind of wrote this up in a draft paper and I sent it to George and his family. And some of them were very kind and said, "Oh, that's great, Ben. That's really interesting. We never knew that." But one of them, a cousin of George's who still lives in the islands, Nathan, he emailed me, and I'm so grateful for his honesty and his transparency. He said, "Ben, no way. That just does not match our culture. That is, our people would never do that. That's a European thing." And I said, "Oh, he's probably right." And so I went back to the library. I just read some more ethnographies about the Hawaiian people, and I learned something very important about the Hawaiian people. And that is, this is a quote from one of those ethnographies, a quote from one of his informants, one of the native Hawaiians that he spoke to. He said, "We are like crabs in a basket. As soon as one begins to crawl out, the others reach up to pull him back." Now, that may sound harsh to some of you, but that is very much a central tenet of Hawaiian culture. That's this idea of equality and egalitarianism, that if someone tries to elevate themselves above the community, that is taboo. That is not good. And they try to stay equal with one another, with the exception of the chiefs and the chiefesses. That is a separate class. But among the commoners class, there's this egalitarianism and equality. And so with that insight and with that piece of information, I was able to go back and rethink about what this pattern in the ceramics actually means. And what I think it means, and Nathan and others have told me that this is much more consistent with Hawaiian culture, is that instead of trying to show off their wealth or their status, what George's family was doing was trying to present their very best for their guests or for their family, right? And so when they had people over to share a meal or to share a celebration, they brought out their very best, not to show off, but to show how much they cared about their friends and about their family, their ohana. This is a wonderful picture, by the way, that I think George provided me of some of his aunts. These are 4 of the Mahoe daughters at Iosepa. So two other objects that I want to highlight quickly, maybe 3. Some people ask, well, is there anything from the islands themselves that you found at Iosepa? And I can actually say there's only 2 things that I can say for sure probably did not come from the mainland, or at least came from the ocean, I should say. And one was this small cowrie shell. It's been perforated to serve as a bead of some kind. The descendants still use these cowrie shell necklaces and to decorate the graves at the cemetery. Perhaps Charmaine can say more about that. And then there was this object that came out of the privy, which is it's mother of pearl abalone shell carved into the shape of a heart. It did have some remnants of paint on it, like something, maybe a floral painting design on it. Not much of it survives, but I think this was some kind of a brooch, some kind of a ornamental piece of jewelry that probably George's grandmother or some of his aunties used at one time, and that was discarded for some reason or another in the privy. Obviously, shells like this don't exist naturally in Utah, so I think these either came with them from the islands or were sent at another time during their occupation of Iosepa. Now, two other objects, both are bottles that I want to end on, because these are funny and touching stories. Out of the privy came this little bottle fragment. It's not anything special. At least we didn't think it was anything special. Just a fairly nondescript clear glass bottle, broken. So you have a little bit of the base. But as we were washing it after taking it out of the earth, one of the students noticed that it had some embossed lettering at the base there, at the heel. And we looked at that and it said, patented June 19th, 1894. And I said, well, you know, Google has this database of patents. Let's go to Google and see if there's something about a patent on that date for a bottle of some kind. And sure enough, thanks to Google, we found a patent on that same date, June 19th, 1894, for a nursing bottle. And this particular image of the patent showed a rectangular bottle. This one was circular, but if you read the actual patent, it says that it was made in both round and rectangular shapes. This got me really excited, of course, and I couldn't wait to show this to George and his family. And we got the opportunity to do that. But and so George has been able to hold this nursing bottle that his aunties or uncles or his grandma and grandpa used while they were living at Iosepa, right? And this was one of those, again, very tangible moments when the past and the present came together in a powerful way. And it was very, very exciting to be there, and very emotional to be there, and to have George and his family touch something and rediscover something from their ancestors that they would have never known about before otherwise. Maybe I should have ended with that story and not this funny story, but I'll end with this funny story. Several other bottles came out of that privy. And the day that George and his family were visiting, we had purposely left some of the privy unexcavated because we wanted them to see objects coming out in real time, if you will. And sure enough, one of the first bottles that came out that day was this bottle on the bottom left, or bottom right, excuse me. It has just a bit of its label still on it. And if you zoom in on that label, you can see that it's a bourbon bottle, it's whiskey. And I got really nervous about this because I knew that George's ancestors were Latter-day Saints, and that Latter-day Saints aren't supposed to drink alcohol typically, although at this time of Iosepa, that was still kind of being established. I didn't know how George and his family would react to this, whether they'd be angry and deny that this could be from his family. But George, in true wonderful fashion, he immediately said, "Oh, Ben, don't worry about that." He's like, "We know Grandpa John liked to have a drink every now and then." and I let out a big sigh of relief, and I was so grateful to hear that. And again, just another connection, another little bit of evidence, a little bit of information for George and his family to connect to their ancestors this way, and to have tangible objects that his grandma, his grandpa, and his aunts and uncles actually used while living there. So there's so much more we can say. Maybe I'll throw a link in the chat to a presentation that I made about Iosepa that talks about other things that we found and other things that were learned from Iosepa. But I'm going to end it there because we got to give Charmaine time to share her stories as well. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Ben.